Welcome to another edition of The Leaders. I'm Yuli Ismatano from Asia Views, still in Colombo, Sri Lanka, to meet with two leaders of Sri Lanka's civil society. Today we will meet with Mr. Ananda Galappatti, a biologist turned psychosociologist who has devoted himself to victims of natural disasters and civil conflicts. Upon returning from his studies at Cambridge University in the UK and in Dhaka, Bangladesh, Mr. Galappatti joined a group providing mental health care for trauma victims of the decades-long civil war. Following the devastating 2004 tsunami, Mr. Galappatti formed the Mangrove, a network of organizations and individuals coordinating psychosocial aspects of the relief efforts at Batticaloa, eastern Sri Lanka, where he is now based. Ananda, thank you for being with the Leaders Program.
Thank you for having me on the program.
How did you first get involved with trauma victims in Sri Lanka? Was it something you studied for in university?
No, actually it was not. I went off to university to do my first degree in molecular cell biology, and while I was there I drifted into the field of psychology, but was never really convinced that I had the stomach for the nerve for working with people who had suffered either mental illness or any type of terrible experience. But I fell into it sort of by accident. Returning to Sri Lanka at the age of about 21, I volunteered with an organization that essentially provided services for victims of torture. My interest was in working with children who'd been affected by conflict and looking at ways in which school services could strengthen their ability to cope. And as it goes, once I got into that work, I soon realized that even a little bit of skill or knowledge I had some value in a field that really desperately needed human resources, and was at that time emerging from one paradigm of work into another which was better equipped to deal with the large scale of problems created by conflict and displacement in Sri Lanka.
Ananda, how did you first get involved with trauma victims in Sri Lanka? Was it something that you originally studied for, or did you come by accident?
Well, it was almost entirely by accident. I actually went off to study molecular cell biology as for my first degree, but in the course of my studies found that I was actually more interested in people than in cells, and wound up shifting into the area of developmental psychology. And on my return to Sri Lanka, I did my studies in the UK. I looked for a way in which I could be helpful in the country, and it seemed to me that working with children who'd experienced conflict might be a way in which I could do that. So I actually started working with an organization that provided services for victims of torture and also other people affected by the conflict. And that's really how I got involved. Sri Lanka's had a number of conflicts over the years. We've had class-based uprisings in the south of the country and in the central parts of the country, in quite brutal ones in 1971, and then again in the late 1980s. And we've had a separatist ethnic conflict for over 25 years that's been mostly in the north and east of the country, but has affected the country as a whole. So really there's quite a wide range of problems and populations that required services. And once I got involved in this kind of work, it seemed there was almost no end to it.
Now, you were, I understand, involved with Dr. Gamila Samarisinghe's survey in Sri Lanka's conflict zones. Was that a determining factor?
It certainly had an influence. We did work with communities both affected by the separatist conflict as well as by the southern insurrection in the late 1980s, and found even years after the actual violence had ended, that many people were actually still suffering terribly the effects. What was really quite influential in determining what we did next was that we started to understand that it wasn't just one-off terrible experiences of loss of spouses or loss of property or displacement that cause suffering, but also the consequences of these: social isolation, the lack of, the breakdown of relationships within a given village, the challenges for a woman fitting into new role of caring for the family, but also playing a role as a main economic provider. Those sorts of things started to shift us away from a focus on the purely psychological to a realization that the social aspects of people's lives and the social effects of conflict were as important a part of the problem, and that we needed to start developing means of intervention that addressed both aspects, the psychological and the social.
Now, who did you work with? Which organization, or was it the government that you worked with in this field?
Well, initially I worked with a small trust fund that first did this research study, and then also later became a service provider, training personnel in areas affected by conflict. But over the years, I've actually worked with a wide range of institutions, including the state health and education services. The thing about the fields that I work in is that if one defines the problems broadly as they exist in people's realities, you actually have to have very broad responses, and no single organization or single sector can actually respond adequately to these range of problems. So you really need a very sort of intersectoral and holistic sort of approach when you try to provide services for populations that have been affected by war or by natural disaster.